Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Hello plant lovers, thank you very much for finding me. I grow, if you're interested, cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Australia, Melbourne to be precise, without any grow lights or greenhouses or humidifiers, just me and them either indoors or outdoors, or they're out of the pool. So plant lovers, if that sounds like your climate, do hit subscribe. I post once a week on a Friday, charting my continuing adventures in trying to find things that grow for me here in Australia. And yes, let us look at this. So something slightly left of field for you this week, plant lovers. Look at that, single spike in a pot. This, plant lovers, is it's a hybrid of two Australian species of terrestrial orchids. So I wanted to talk about terrestrial orchids generally, obviously specifically this one, but terrestrial orchids are found all over the world apart from Antarctica, but maybe I should Google that because who knows. And they are often super easy if you get ones from your region and a little left of field, but very rewarding. Anyway, without further ado, let me introduce you to Diuris, and this is a natural hybrid between pardina and behrii. So apparently this genus is a little bit, how shall we say, friendly with one another. So naturally occurring hybrids are very common, which apparently causes a nightmare for taxonomists, but then again, I think taxonomists deserve to be tortured sometimes because of their crazy naming schedule. But anyway, so this is a terrestrial orchid that is endemic to the southeast of Australia. So basically where I am, and curving up a little bit to New South Wales, the state above me. So pardina, one of the parents, has a bigger distribution, and the other parent, behrii, is only found in my state. So these two have found each other in perfect harmony and created this charming megamix hybrid offspring. Let's talk names, shall we? Why not? Diuris. Now generally this group of orchids, which are found all over Australia, are often generically called donkey orchids. Perhaps you can see a family likeness in the flower. But Diuris itself comes from two Greek words. The first, dis, means double, and the second part, aura, meaning tail. So putting 6 and 12 together, it is referring to these two hanging sepals here. So one of these, pardina, comes from the Greek word pardos, which means leopard, and that is one of the common names of this particular orchid, perhaps because of the spotting and the colouring of the flower. Okay, so there we go. We've established the who, but I was just really curious to try and have a go at growing some Australian terrestrial orchids because I figured I could essentially put them in a pot and then just leave them outside to do their thing. And I've kind of been proven correct. So there you are. We will go through the care bit by bit. Firstly then, let's think of the south and the southeast of Australia. So we generally have wet and cold winters and dry and often very hot summers. So you can imagine that is kind of the cycle of these plants, and essentially they do their growing in winter, they bloom in spring, it's the first weeks of spring now, and then they are dormant. So they are essentially a herbaceous perennial, so not unlike many other bulbs like tulips or gladioli bulbs or many other bulbs which do their growth in winter, their flowering in spring, early spring, and then they die and disappear and like to be comparatively dry over summer, because a wet bulb can often equal rotting. And the natural habitat of these is kind of, we don't really have meadows in Australia, but that kind of open grassland or slightly dappled light. So not shade or deep shade, but a little bit of shade from other plants and shrubs, or in sort of more of a grassy open area. And I've seen these on the edges of forests and in open grassland, so quite a variety. And I've decided in my infinite wisdom that this baby is basically going to get full sun. So it is sitting out the front by the post box, which is the sunniest part of our rental house, where it gets quite strong, well, it gets direct, strong light from about mid-morning all the way through to the rest of the day. I noticed that the leaf shoot emerged at the beginning of winter, so late autumn, early winter, and it just sat for a bit. And in fact, this was actually then run over by the postman because it is near the post box. as it had just emerged, and I thought, oh, I cannot believe it. But anyway, the plant was intact, but this is why I've actually got bits of broken terracotta pot on the top, not some cunning drainage plan, and I just had to repot it, but it already started to sprout and I was a bit worried, but it is fine. The bulb itself is, I guess, perhaps most similar to a bluebell bulb. So it was about that long, quite elongated, like a shallot, and I planted it about halfway down, so it had a good inch or a couple of centimeters between the tip of the bulb and the top of the soil level. So the other curious thing is, I made a video about what do you pot your orchid in, which I will link, and one of the weirder things I mentioned was clay. And this, plant lovers, was why I had to go and get myself a bag of clay, because this plant grows in, well, it grows throughout the state, so many different soil types, but often quite harsh and not particularly fertile soils. So the grower I bought this from suggested you mix a little bit of clay in with a regular potting mix. So I also put in here sand, clay, not a huge amount of clay, and a regular potting mix. So nothing, I tried to keep the fertility down and the draining up. Although obviously that's counterintuitive because clay doesn't drain. But anyway, that's the mix that this orchid is in. And look, it's bloomed and it's happy. Fertilizer wise, I made the executive decision, because these come from quite unfertile soil, I decided not to put any slow release fertilizer in the pot, which I always do with my orchids. So in this case I didn't, and I don't fertilize it. My reason being that I have mixed a regular potting mix with a bit of clay and a bit of sandy grit to give it a bit of sort of coarseness, and in that potting mix, because it's out of the bag, there is going to be nutrient. So I don't want to kind of overcook the cake, because the area that these grow in is quite harsh. It's quite stony, it's quite sandy, it's obviously a bit of clayey, so not an orchid that wants super rich soil environments and lots of fertilizing. So a lot of Australian native plants are very sensitive to phosphorus, for example, so you have to be super careful. And if you've kind of got local soil, then you almost really don't need to fertilize something that's native. And I would say if you're growing a native terrestrial orchid that's from Africa or from the Mediterranean basin or from Britain or from North America, similar, I would suggest not fertilizing it too much. Obviously it depends on the species, so take that with a grain of salt, but some might be woodland plants that actually do love a little bit more humus, for example. Don't know. Anyway, this one has no fertilizer in the mix, nor any liquid applications afterwards. Now the other news is they are supposed to form clumps, and as in most bulbs it will produce bulbils, but also it's going to be pollinated because it's in its native area. We'll see. Orchids are very tricky to grow from seed, but this is kind of in its local area, so we'll see what happens. Should the seed fall in this pot, I'd be very happy to get plantlets, but I'm not sure if it's that simple. Weird factoids then, this type of orchid, Diuris, does not produce nectar and it doesn't smell, not an ounce of fragrance. So apparently its pollinating technique is to trick insects into thinking, ooh, look at that fabulous coloured flower. Oh, it looks like another wasp or another bee. So it attracts insects and they get nothing out of the process, unfortunately. So it's a very cunning orchid. Now I bought this from a specialist supplier on eBay in Australia, and I'll put the link below if you're interested. He only sells things at the beginning of the dormancy season, so from autumn through to the beginning of winter, because that's when the bulbs are dormant. That is the easiest time to sell and transport these bulbs. I can almost guarantee that he wouldn't ship them internationally though, so if you're watching from somewhere outside of Australia, you will have to find your own native terrestrial orchids, which brings us to the fact, plant lovers, that in continental Europe, in Asia, in Britain, in the Americas, there are a lot of terrestrial orchids. So basically everywhere except Antarctica, and I've said that and I'm not sure, but I'm presuming it's the case. There are versions of these terrestrial herbaceous orchids which will grow at whatever point, become deciduous, die down, rinse and repeat. I've seen some amazing ones from various parts of Africa, various species, some beautiful ones from the Mediterranean regions. Britain has some amazing native orchids that do the same thing, as does the States. So wherever you are, you could, I am sure, find native terrestrial orchids and a specialist who is producing them and give them a good Aussie go, because essentially no care. I'm leaving this outside. I'm not watering it. It is getting whatever nature throws at it because it's in its native environment. And you get this amazing, beautiful flower. I would suggest if you're an orchid grower and you've got a bit of space, get yourself a plant pot and get yourself some native species. Now, a lot of them will actually clump up. And I was actually looking at some plants yesterday in an amazing grower's collection, and he only grows bulbous things, and that includes many things that aren't exclusively orchids. But he just had some incredible specimens that had filled out the pot and were overflowing vegetation and flowers. Now, this one I don't think is going to be that sort, but I feel that a lot of those terrestrial orchid types from the Mediterranean area, from parts of Africa and from Britain certainly will do that. We'll give you a huge pot full of plants relatively quickly. So there you go. Low maintenance, kind of interesting. This I feel is just beautiful. So I bought this as an experiment, and I'm here to tell you, plant lovers, that come autumn, winter, I am going to go back to that cellar and see what else he's got, because I'm now here to tell you I am committed to Australian terrestrial orchids. You know what though, we should perhaps go no further than the Bible of Australian orchids, Orchids of Australia by W.H. Nichols, which I have oft referenced, and look what happens to be on the cover, a Diuris orchid. And Mr. Nichols says about Diuris, it is a genus of over 40 species, all of them confined to Australia, with the exception of one which is from Timor. Now, this was first written in the 1930s, so he's saying 40 species. I would imagine that more have been identified since then, because that is the way of the world. Luckily, with orchids, we hear so many terrible stories about extinctions, but also a great number of plants are discovered every year. So I would hazard a guess that there are more than 40 now. And one of the parents, pardina, used to be known as Diuris maculata, and here we have an illustration of it, which is very beautiful, and I think you can see the family resemblance. There we are, plant lovers, Australian Terrestrial Orchids 101. But no matter where you are in the world, there will be terrestrial species that are perhaps perennial, herbaceous, that you can kind of do the same thing with. Just pop them in a pot, put them on your terrace or your balcony or your kitchen windowsill or in the garden if you've got the space, and just see what happens. Super easy, no fuss. This has been run over by the post person. It's lived to tell another tale, so there you go. It is a very, very, very beautiful orchid, and I am thrilled it bloomed for me. So I am now going to get myself more. But until then, plant lovers, wherever you are, investigate your local terrestrial orchid possibilities, and I look forward to seeing you next week. I do post once a week on a Friday, so hit subscribe if you want to know immediately what my continuing amateur adventure is, and I look forward to seeing you next week.